Rebuilding Syria was never going to be an easy process, but 4 months after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, you'd be well within your right to believe that Syria is doomed. From incredibly brutal sectarian violence in the nation's northwest, to growing mistrust of a leader with an exceptionally dark history, to the crush of international sanctions and the ongoing tug-of-war over Syria by more powerful world nations, this fragile nation faces a very grim set of circumstances. Right now, it feels as if Syria is on a knife's edge, still capable of growing into something greater than it once was, but just as likely, if not more so, to descend yet again into madness. But today, in 2025, just as it was through the entire Syrian civil war, and even before that, explosive headlines across the globe miss one absolutely critical fact about this nation. Syria, now as much as ever, is complicated, and the reality of the situation there is far more complex and far more nuanced than breathless and rightfully shocked global reporting would have us believe. So today we're going to honor a request our WarFronts community made in the days after the fall of the Assad regime. Back then, he asked us to stay in tune with the Syrian reconstruction, watch affairs there closely, and, in time, explore the process of rebuilding in all its detail. Well, now it's time we pull back the curtain to reveal not only the shock and horror of Syria's recent ordeal, but the countless developments happening at the very same time. Did the Syrian war ever actually end? That's a fair enough question, and one that could be answered in a few different ways. Yeah, it ended because Bashar al-Assad has been ousted. Damascus has been claimed by a new government, and the situation across Syria is fundamentally different than what it had been during the years of civil war. Or no, maybe it didn't end, because this conflict, which has always been multidimensional and chaotic in terms of who's fighting who, is still ongoing, and it's just the details of who's fighting who that have changed. Either answer is justifiable, and so is the argument that Syria's entered a liminal space between civil war and not civil war, but really, it's all just semantics. Call it the civil war or don't, but the thing that's going on in Syria today is an ongoing cycle of low-grade violence in several directions at once, with the potential to spiral out of control in entirely new ways. And look, if we're going to talk about violence, then we simply have to start with the aftermath of the massacres that took place in early March. Now, we published a separate episode here on WarFronts in the days immediately following the worst of the violence to explain what went on in those governorates or provinces of Latakia and Tartus at that time. So rather than giving a day-by-day account of the violence here, we'll refer you to that prior episode. But to get our bearings, let's recap the situation real briefly. Starting on March the 6th of this year, units from the state security forces of the Syrian transitional government, as well as government-allied militias and civilians operating independently or in groups, massacred an estimated 1,600 or more Syrian civilians in those two provinces that we just mentioned, Latakia and Tartus. The vast majority of civilians killed were members of Syria's Alawite minority, the same ethno-religious group that the recently deposed former dictator Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez were a part of. Across about a week of intense violence, hundreds of security forces and hundreds of pro-Assad insurgents were also killed, but the vast majority of the bloodshed was through acts amounting to ethnic cleansing. Systematic extermination of Alawites, especially men and boys of fighting age, but also women, children, and the elderly. In the weeks following the massacres, a flood of information has come to light through the efforts of Syrian and international journalists, investigations via the transitional government, and more. So for our purposes today, we're going to focus on that context and the response to the massacres rather than the massacres themselves. But before we do, we'd like to be exceptionally clear. At no point in the effort to understand, contextualize, and explore these massacres and their after effects can any of the violence be justified. Quite frankly, we wouldn't have thought this is needed to be said on a channel discussing global conflicts in depth, but there is a massive difference between understanding why atrocities happened and excusing atrocities. Understanding them is vital. Excusing them is simply not something we're interested in here at WarFronts, whether it's done by factions in Syria, by Russian troops, or Ukrainian ones, by the IDF or by Hamas, or by any other party in any global conflict. Hopefully we're clear on that point, so we'll move forward. Now, the massacre of Alawites that took place in early March was not the first sign of trouble in the northwest corner of Syria. Regime loyalists had been active across the country since the days after Assad fled the country, and loyalist ambushes of Syrian security forces started up in Tartus as early as mid-December. Those attacks grew more brazen and more effective as the weeks wore on, to the point that loyalists were launching frequent attacks on checkpoints, ambushing pairs or small groups of soldiers loyal to the interim government, and conducting frequent targeted assassinations against a range of targets by February. We refer to these insurgent forces as loyalists, by the way, because they're remnant factions of the Assad regime, but their degree of direct loyalty to Bashar al-Assad personally is a matter of some debate. With the benefit of time to put together disparate bits of information, regional experts have pieced together that these forces appear to be directly loyal to one Major General Suhail al-Hassan. Hassan spent years as one of Bashar al-Assad's most effective and favored generals, and was even seen as being a potential successor to Assad one day. Al-Hassan is in hiding and hasn't been seen since the fall of Assad, but he's thought to be coordinating what might be thousands of regime-loyalist soldiers, including a high proportion of former special operations personnel. That's important to understand here, that although the average Syrian soldier before the fall of Assad was under-equipped, under-trained, and quite possibly conscripted against his will, the best soldiers of the Syrian regime were highly competent operators, often with the deepest loyalty and the most to personally gain from the old regime. In the weeks leading up to the Alawite massacres, violence had gone both ways in Latakia and Tartus. Soldiers of the new Syrian government, as well as allied militias, had carried out arrests, assassinations, raids, and other operations against loyalist factions they were able to track down. The places where this insurgent cat-and-mouse game was happening, Latakia and Tartus, really matter here, because this is where Syria's Alawite population forms a local majority. As a result, the area has long been a center of power for the Assad regime, and it's still a place where insurgents still fighting for Assad's basic cause can expect to garner real local support. We said it before on WarFronts, and we'll say it again. Syrian Alawites are not an ideological monolith. Many detest the Assad regime and always have. At the same time, many do harbor a lasting fondness for that political dynasty, and many owe their personal and community wealth to well-compensated positions as part of the sprawling Assad-era bureaucracy. That in turn contributes not just to the conditions that led Assad loyalist factions to believe they'd draw more public support in those areas, but to perceptions in other Syrian communities that the Alawites are uniformly loyal to Assad and uniformly hostile to anti-Assad factions, when that simply isn't the case. It's that combination of factors that created a powder keg in Latakia and Tartus by the time the massacres began. But in the wake of the violence, it's become clear that the spark that blew the whole thing up was entirely deliberate. The pro-Assad insurgency in the two provinces was operating largely out of highland areas, where they're harder to attack in large numbers, and as cells in population centers where they can blend in with ordinary people and work in a highly decentralized way. Those same areas were patrolled by security forces under the new Syrian government, who we've also got to understand a bit better. The new Syrian military is a patchwork organization bringing together fighters from a wide range of ex-rebel factions with varying ideologies, backgrounds, motivations, and priorities in this new ecosystem. While those fighters are now nominally under the control of the Syrian interim government, the truth of the matter is way more complicated. In fact, the choice to unify all those fighters under the government's banner was not because they're inclined to work well together or because they're inclined to follow orders from their hierarchical superiors. With Assad gone, the new Syrian government has had to attempt to manage a situation where tens of thousands of now ex-rebels are already organized into their own fighting groups with their own armament, and again, a wide variety of motivations and ideologies. That is a recipe for disaster, and if the situation were allowed to go unchecked, it could very quickly lead to all-out anarchy. The transitional government's answer so far has been to offer those groups a spot as either members of or semi-autonomous partners with the new Syrian security forces, but that is very much a band-aid solution. Because of a mix of internal ruin and international sanctions, Syria can't provide salaries to most of those ex-rebels. Because of a combination of ongoing violence, decentralization, and in-group loyalties, Syria hasn't been able to offer any large-scale training for them. As a result, they've remained loyal to their own commanders, who've found their own ways to compensate their fighters for the continued loyalty. If and when those commanders decide on a course of action that's unsanctioned by the government back in Damascus, Syria's transitional leadership has little means to stop them. That danger is even greater when it comes to semi-autonomous but generally pro-government militias that Damascus has even less ability to control. That was a dynamic that these pro-Assad insurgents demonstrated a profound ability to exploit. In a wave of attacks immediately prior to the start of the massacres, insurgent factions appear to have launched their own attacks, deliberately targeting the Sunni Muslim population in Latakia and Tartus, the same ethno-religious group that a large proportion of the nation, and especially anti-Assad factions, belong to. The response by security forces active in the area was swift, reactionary, informed by deeply held resentment against the Alawite community, and entirely predictable. 2 ex-militias integrated to Syrian security forces appear to have played an outsized role in what came next. The Suleiman Shah Brigade and the Hamza Division Brigade, each with a known history of committing other atrocities as recently as 2023. They were joined by a range of nominally pro-government militias, firebrand Islamist and pro-Turkish fighting factions who'd integrated to the government, and foreign fighters mixed in with them, but other fighting groups with little or no direct connection to the government, and ordinary civilians who grabbed weapons, came to Latakia and Tartus either in groups or independently, and took full advantage of the violence and chaos to take indiscriminate vengeance for old wounds. Local fundamentalist imams, military leaders, and others took full advantage of the situation, inflaming the violence through rhetoric as firestorms of disinformation online accelerated the carnage even further. The results were absolutely horrific. Mass killings of Alawites, the use of torture, mass arson, mass looting, and a range of other crimes against humanity amounting to an act of ethnic cleansing. Now, we would hope that it goes without saying that in attempting to explain what happened, we at WarFronts have absolutely zero desire to excuse it. Understanding what happened and why, however, is the only way to form a reasonable personal or policy response, and by far the most important question in the aftermath has been just how culpable the Syrian transitional government was in what happened. Certainly, there were unquestionable failures here, allowing groups with a known recent history of atrocities to be working on behalf of the government in an armed role, let alone in such a sensitive region, being unable to stop the violence for so long once it began, and the government's far larger failure to get ahead of explosions in sectarian violence that were entirely foreseeable. But the thing that would supersede all of that is if the Syrian transitional government made the choice to let the violence continue instead of simply being unable to stop it. Even worse would be a situation where the transitional government actively facilitated the violence. To be clear, it's still not fully certain that they didn't do exactly that, as we write this a full month after the massacres began. But both at the time of the attacks and in the aftermath, the vast majority of experts on Syria agree that the transitional government didn't act to inflame or allow the massacres on purpose. Nor is that just the opinion of some stuffed-up academics pontificating on the region. Internationally, countries that supported all sides of the Syrian civil war and operate at cross purposes more broadly all declined to place blame on the interim government, presumably informed by far better intelligence than we've got in the public domain. The notable exception was Israel, but we'll be getting to them separately. Although investigations have yet to really ramp up, the transitional government has made repeated commitments to fully prosecute all of those involved and appears to be taking early action to do so, although, like everything else the transitional government has to do, it's operating with very little bandwidth right now. And notably, insurgent leaders have been publicly taking credit for what happened. As one Alawite insurgent commander put it in a written statement on March the 18th, "Our first round was a round of revenge for our people and martyrs, not a battle of liberation. With simple capabilities and small numbers, we destroyed our enemy's entity. He did not realize this and took revenge by killing women and children. It was a tour of blood triumphing over the sword." Of course, even if the transitional government was truly not complicit, they were utterly incapable of stopping or preventing what happened, and that is damning in itself. But unfortunately, ousting the current leadership in response would be counterproductive. As we'll reference several times throughout today's episode, there is no clear, better alternative to lead Syria right now. There are options that might be a little better or a little worse, and there are options that would be apocalyptically bad for everyone, and that's about it. Not only that, but most diplomats and experts on the region have either stayed mum or openly admitted that some degree of retributive violence across Syria was to be expected. Every group in the country now carries its own deep scars from almost a decade and a half of war, and modern history is littered with examples of mass bloodletting just like this one. The question now is the question of what Syria's leaders do in the aftermath. Foreign powers have made it abundantly clear that the nation's future hangs in the balance. According to recent reporting, European envoys visited Syria during the height of the massacres and impressed upon Syria's interim foreign minister that unless the jihadi fighters perpetrating the massacres were dealt with, there would be no international support for the new government. Said a spokesman for the French Foreign Ministry when asked what French envoys expressed in Damascus, quote, The abuses that have taken place in recent days are truly intolerable, and those responsible must be identified and condemned. There is no blank check for the new authorities. In the weeks after most of the violence in Latakia and Tartus calmed down, it became clear that the pro-Assad insurgency in the area wouldn't be going away anytime soon. In the final week of March, violence in the area flared repeatedly, including a large-scale attack by regime loyalists on a police station in Latakia city, several ambushes in and around Tartus city, and multiple raids by local security forces against insurgents' hideouts. The previous week was no better, and the insurgency isn't constrained only to those provinces either. All over the country, pro-regime cells are popping up, launching ambushes, raids, sabotage operations, and more, including in and around the capital city of Damascus. At the same time, however, the Syrian transitional government has taken early steps to make things right, with the Alawite community agreeing to the release of detainees, suspending arrests of people who don't pose an imminent threat, working with Alawite community leaders to have excess firearms and ammunition handed over to the interim government in areas that don't support the insurgents, and more. That said, a high proportion of Alawites now live in deep fear of the interim government, and fairly so. Under the Assad regime, Alawites were told constantly that if Assad's regime fell, retributive attacks against all Alawites would come next, something that brought Assad a measure of loyalty even from people who disagreed with his regime's treatment of other Syrians. Now those worst fears have come true, and the insurgency will be able to both lean on the Alawite community more heavily in the future and position itself as a protector against a government that can't be trusted not to commit acts of ethnic cleansing in the future. From that exceptionally tenuous situation in the Syrian northwest, we turn to other parts of the country where violence is ongoing, starting with the continued threat posed by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS. Ever since the destruction of the group's land-holding caliphate, ISIS remnants have fought a much more pragmatic, asymmetric battle against all other parties to the Syrian conflict, and even before the fall of Assad, they were rapidly growing in strength. Despite the intermittent deaths of high-ranking officials, ISIS has taken to running extortive rackets against civilians in the countryside, ambushing and absconding with oil tankers, and using targeted assassinations in a push to establish local dominance in areas where government control is practically non-existent. During the month of March, the Islamic State has launched all manner of attacks against the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, in the northeast, including numerous assaults on checkpoints and patrols, as well as particularly notable targeted attacks against specific SDF officials. SDF paramilitary fighters have captured several Islamic State commanders and low-level fighters, sometimes fighting alongside US troops, and ISIS even suffered the loss of its emir of operations in Syria and Iraq after a targeted airstrike on Iraqi soil. The jihadis, however, remain undeterred, and they've forced several large skirmishes with SDF fighters over the last few weeks. Sensing weakness in the SDF's position inside Syria, the Islamic State appears to be taking full advantage of its opportunity, pushing slowly toward realizing the prospect of jailbreaks for the group's nearly 10,000 detained fighters in SDF custody, as well as tens of thousands more people with ties to the organization. The SDF, however, has recently secured an agreement with Damascus that should be a major boon to both the Kurdish-led paramilitary and the larger autonomous government of northeast Syria. In mid-March, the SDF agreed to a deal with Damascus, in which the SDF will join Syria's new state institutions, integrate its civil and military apparatus into Syria, concede the oil and gas fields it controls, assume direct control over border crossings in the northeast region, and integrate its paramilitaries into the Syrian Defense Ministry. That announcement was taken as a major victory for both Damascus and the SDF, with the Kurdish-led government now under the protection of a sovereign national government and the interim Syrian administration, reunifying a very large swath of the country. Some details have yet to be hashed out, and the deal will take the better part of a year to implement fully, but it's still a fairly massive development. And it's made all the more important because it frees Kurdish fighters up from other obligations to better wage a counterinsurgent effort against the Islamic State. For months after the fall of Assad, Kurdish forces have been on a high alert for a potentially massive assault from Turkey, but thanks to similarly massive developments in Turkey, it now appears that those fears will not be realized anytime soon. That means that the forces who've been placed into a defensive posture can now resume their work. Speaking of Turkey, however, Turkish-backed forces in Syria have continued to clash intermittently with Kurdish forces even after the deal was announced. Those clashes are centered around battle lines in the vicinity of the strategically critical Tishrin Dam, and they've been accompanied by attacks from Turkish-based groups against Kurdish civilians and journalists who've been made a part of the Kurdish-led effort to secure the dam. Recently, an attack by as-yet unidentified assailants enabled a prison break in an area controlled by Turkish-backed militants, with numerous inmates escaping a detention center that held Kurdish fighters, ISIS militants, and violent criminals. The battles between SDF and Turkish-supported forces have yet to resolve in the north-central portion of Syria, even despite the broad developments in Syria and Turkey that would ordinarily be expected to bring a conclusion. Then there's the situation in southern Syria, where the nation of Israel has made good on its promise of an indefinite occupation of land south of Damascus. After expanding into that territory in the days following the fall of Assad, Israel has slowly and incrementally expanded its territory, and it's launched an ongoing air campaign against targets all across the country. The Israeli occupation is a highly controversial one, drawing condemnation from much of the world, including traditional allies of Jerusalem, but gaining support from advocates who argue that Israel is a vital stabilizing force. Certainly, some of Israel's early actions during the occupation prevented what could have been a massive loss of life. Israel's first waves of airstrikes across Syria as the Assad dynasty was crumbling, as well as some airstrikes since that time, targeted what Israel claimed were stockpiles of chemical weapons kept by the Assad regime. The regime was, indeed, known to have created and deployed chemical weapons during the civil war, and ensuring that nobody could use those weapons amidst the chaos of Assad's ouster may have averted what could have been devastating chemical attacks during the collapse of the regime or afterward. Israel's stated strategic objectives in southern Syria seem to be rather straightforward: securing a buffer zone and nearby strategic points to prevent a spillover of violence, preventing Iran-backed groups from reconsolidating their smuggling lines, protecting Druze communities in southern Syria, and more. To be clear, those acts still constituted a land invasion of a sovereign nation, which is a fairly major problem in itself, and has been widely condemned as a land grab that simply uses the safety of Druze communities as a convenient pretext. Yet on paper, at least for the early days of Israel's occupation, there was still room for an outcome that minimized harm overall, didn't interfere too terribly with the process of Syrian reconstruction, and resolved at some point in the relatively near future. Fast forward by 4 months, however, and it's become increasingly clear that Israel's occupation doesn't just seem as if it will continue indefinitely. It's also got real potential to destabilize Syria for the long term, and in many ways, it's already done that. Now we'll start with the destruction by way of airstrikes of much of the Syrian regime's military equipment. Certainly, that's equipment that neither Israel nor anybody else would want falling into the wrong hands. In the early days of the takeover by Syria's rebel coalition, when there were few hard guarantees about how they'd act and who they would or wouldn't come after, the destruction of that equipment functioned as an insurance policy against far worse violence. And in fact, the recent massacres of Alawites in northern Syria have been cited as a sort of retroactive justification for the destruction of the Syrian transitional government's equipment. After all, how much worse would the killing have been if Syrian forces had heavier weapons at their disposal? Those arguments, however, miss a far larger series of problems that the destruction of that military equipment has caused. First, reducing the new Syrian military to an organization fighting with little more than weapons of a non-state insurgency means that when an actual insurgency starts to rear its head, that insurgent faction is fighting something much closer to a peer adversary. In turn, that hands the insurgency a massive tactical advantage and strategic advantage. It allows them to be far more effective as an asymmetric fighting force, and it forces the Syrian government to have its troops, including the less trustworthy ones, fighting in ways that put them into far greater contact with civilians. That's a change in circumstances that doesn't just embolden pro-Assad insurgents. It allows groups like Hezbollah, organized criminals, and even ISIS to level the playing field and be far more effective over time than they otherwise would have been. And again, while we can debate the Syrian transitional government's trustworthiness and its ability to meet those challenges responsibly all day, there is not a meaningfully better alternative. There are groups that might be marginally better or worse, but who have less of an ability to keep Syria cohesive, and there are really awful options like ISIS or remnants of the Assad regime. Those are the options, and destroying Syria's military infrastructure doesn't magically create a better alternative. And there's also a pair of much larger geopolitical problems to consider here, starting with the reality that one thing Israel really didn't want to have happen here is for the new Syrian government to fall in with Turkey as an international backer. Indeed, the transitional government was initially inclined to resist Turkish influence and create distance with Ankara, but their lack of military power, and thus their lack of ability to guarantee their own security, has forced them to accept Turkish influence to a far greater degree than they seem to want. And while Israel's desire to ensure that Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed groups couldn't gain a foothold in an even more unstable post-Assad Syria is consistent with Israel's prior actions across the Middle East, it also shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamics inside Syria. The groups that led the rebel coalition that took Damascus have been very bitter examples of Hezbollah and other Iran-sponsored militias for a long time. By all accounts, their new transitional government would have been more than happy to root them out and deny Syrian territory for their future use, potentially without the need for Israel to urge them to do so. Now, however, the Syrian transitional government has neither the requisite military equipment nor the goodwill toward Israel required to make an arrangement that might have benefited both parties. And even in the areas where Israel has set up its occupation and has framed itself as a defender of the Druze community, it's facing increasing opposition from local fighters who have a long history of defending their own villages in the area. On Wednesday, April the 2nd, the governor's office of the southern Syrian province of Daraa acknowledged that at least 9 locals have been killed in firefights as Israeli forces advanced on a town called Tall al-Jabi. And according to sources in the area, those locals were civilian volunteers attempting only to defend their own town. Israel has framed the men as militants who were guarding, quote, terrorist infrastructure, but those claims conflict starkly with reports from locals who again have been part of local resistance in Daraa for years now. The death toll from that incident has now risen to 11 locals, along with 5 critically wounded. Local mosques in Daraa have begun calling people to arms to resist future Israeli advances, while the provincial government has released warnings that public anger is boiling toward an all-time high. By the way, the last time an unwelcome force ignored boiling public in Daraa, local militias began a large-scale and semi-organized campaign to start kidnapping soldiers and intelligence officers of the Assad regime to force regime intelligence to release people who'd been detained. Suffice to say that these local groups are creative, capable, and bold. On that same day, Israel launched yet another wave of airstrikes against military bases and infrastructure across Syria, and Israel's defense minister appeared to accuse the Syrian transitional government of planning to allow Turkish troops to establish bases on Syrian territory. That direct Turkish involvement, again, is something that the new Syrian government appeared to strongly oppose before its own capabilities were so thoroughly eviscerated by Israeli airstrikes. Syria's leaders have accused Israel of deliberately undermining their efforts to rebuild the nation, although Israel, of course, rejects those claims out of hand. To be clear, Israeli claims of protecting Druze civilians do still carry local weight, especially in the wake of the massacres against Alawites, when in response, Syria's Druze community condemned the Syrian government and rejected any future cooperation with Damascus. Led by the spiritual leader of Syrian Druze, Hikmat al-Hijiri, who called the government, quote, extremist in every sense of the word, much of the Druze community has made it clear that it prefers to accept Israel's protection. But much like the Alawites, the Druze are not a monolith, nor are they anywhere near the only ethno-religious group that lives in this part of Syria. Finally, sporadic attacks across Syria continue in all directions. Former Assad officials and ex-soldiers are liable to find themselves at the point of a gun, assassinated by any number of government-aligned forces, neutral armed groups, or civilians, sometimes acting entirely of their own will. High-profile Assad-era commanders and civil leaders occasionally pop up, some of whom are detained, others of whom are killed, and still others of whom manage to disappear again. Local skirmishes and firefights are not uncommon, as lasting grudges are settled the hard way, and people from every part of Syria's ideological spectrum find reason to inflict violence on one another. Syria's long-thriving drug trade, primarily manufacturing the substance Captagon, has been subject to near constant raids by security forces and have at times responded violently. Kidnapping remains common in several parts of the country, perpetrated by various armed factions, criminal gangs, and local militias, trying to get an upper hand in small, self-contained conflicts. Those who are taken are frequently summarily executed, and at times their bodies are found bearing signs of torture. Tragically, Syria is littered with unexploded ordnance that can detonate when disturbed and often take civilians with it. Weapons caches continue to be identified and confiscated at such a high and continuous frequency that it would imply an incredible amount of work is left to be done. All of this comes in a constant deluge, with absolutely no indication thus far that it'll be stopping anytime soon. Luckily, the violence and destruction ongoing in Syria is not the only thing we've got to account for. All across the nation, there are real and genuine signs of hope and belief that Syria and its people can work their way into a brighter future. We said it before and we'll say it again. The vast majority of internal and international experts on Syria believed that continued violence was inevitable after the fall of Assad. But most of those very same experts have also stressed the potential for Syria to rebuild despite that violence. Make no mistake, nations all across the globe have experienced times like these, only to build back into something greater after a long, painful, but ultimately successful reconstruction. Syria can do the same, although there's no guarantee that it will. We could start with the announcement of the full new cabinet that will oversee the Syrian transition, which has been a matter of considerable speculation for months. The personnel that Syria's transitional president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, chooses to fill the cabinet have been treated as a sort of measuring stick to evaluate just how exclusive or inclusive this new Syrian government is going to be. As we've already referenced, Syria is a very diverse place in terms of religion, ethnicity, ideology, and more, and generally, a government that includes a wider selection of representatives from across Syria's many people is thought to be a government that will better represent Syrians. That government, in turn, will have a better chance of success in both rebuilding the nation and drawing much-needed international support. At the same time, a more inclusive government would show that the formerly hardline Sharaa and his inner circle are making a genuine effort to deliver on the promise of a better Syria for all Syrians, rather than just giving lip service to the idea in order to consolidate their hold on power. And all things considered, the cabinet that Sharaa put forth was an encouraging one. Of the 23 available cabinet seats, over half of them, a total of 14, went to members with no prior links to the Sharaa's former rebel group or the old regional government in Idlib. Just 4 of the cabinet members chosen were former members of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, although those 4 are serving in posts that will make them a sort of inner circle around Sharaa: the Ministers of Defense, Justice, Foreign Affairs, and the Interior. A Christian, an Alawite, and a Kurd each gained seats, along with 19 Sunni Arabs, and notably just 1 member of the cabinet is currently under international sanctions, as opposed to the Assad government cabinet, where a majority of ministers were sanctioned. Although women were poorly represented, with only 1 woman represented as the new Minister of Social Affairs and Labour, the cabinet was rich with technocrats and people with only minimal links to Sharaa, if any at all. The announcement of Sharaa's cabinet was just one in a recent series of positive signs as the nation's civil leaders begin to coalesce around the transitional government despite the recent challenges. The inauguration ceremony for Sharaa's cabinet was attended by major Christian and Druze figures, as well as the new leader of Syria's Islamist Legal Council, led by a moderate who's widely accepted by the Syrian public. The government is slowly filling up with figures who've called for the dismantling and aggressive persecution of ISIS and al-Qaeda, the integration of the Syrian economy into the wider Western world order, and the inclusion of every major group in Syrian society within the government's vision for the future. Sharaa even removed his own brother from the post of health minister, in sharp contrast to the Assad regime's approach to nepotism. This new government is expected to serve for a period of 5 years, during which time a final constitution for Syria will be adapted from the interim constitution passed earlier this month. While that 5-year period has raised eyebrows in the months since Assad fell, recent positive signs and the new setup of the transitional government have been taken as hopeful signs that the delay reflects the government's desire to do the process right, rather than just to extend their time in power. The interim constitution, for its own part, separates Syria's branches of government and creates an independent judiciary, and it's expected to serve Syria well for a couple of years, as long as it's kept as an interim document and not made into a permanent one. There are substantial concerns regarding both the powers that the interim constitution hands to Sharaa directly and its identification of Islamic law as, quote, the main source of new Syrian legislation. But the true impact of either provision can only be revealed with time, and the makeup of Sharaa's new cabinet seems to have potential to counterbalance their effects. And across Syria, despite the extreme hardship of the post-Assad era, ordinary people appear to be optimistic about what the future holds. According to recent poll findings collected and published by The Economist, a full 70% of Syrians express that they feel positively about Syria's future, and an even greater share, 80%, say they feel freer now than they did under the Assad dynasty. Around 80% also say they have a positive view of Ahmed al-Sharaa personally, despite his past, while 2 of every 3 Syrians said their country's security situation is improving. And to be clear, this data was gathered both before and after the massacres of Alawites in March, reflecting an enduring confidence in Syria's situation despite that major setback. As The Economist put it, quote, such numbers must be read with care in a traumatized country with little experience of free speech. But they suggest that despite deep divisions, not least between the Sunni Muslim majority and the once dominant Alawite minority, Syrians still trust Mr. Sharaa to try and rebuild the country. Elsewhere across the country, the return to normalcy seems to have begun. Oil tankers have started to dock again. The first allocations of money to rebuild infrastructure are starting to go out. International flights are resuming. Salaries are starting to be paid again. Humanitarian aid is arriving in greater and greater volumes, and foreigners who'd been granted citizenship because they fought for the Assad regime are starting to be weeded out. The Syrian interim government has been praised by the organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons after it led an inspection team to several chemical weapons production and storage sites, some of which were previously unknown to the Western world. Doctors Without Borders is on the way into areas they haven't been able to access for years. The Syrian Ministry of Justice is working to collaborate with Interpol and hunt down war criminals, and electricity, water, and internet infrastructure are all in the process of being restored. Indeed, despite all the violence and carnage across the country, the security situation in Syria is improving, as ridiculous as that might be to say. Remember, the alternative since 2011 has been a state of nationwide civil war, and as bad as things are now, this combination of gradually reducing violence, gradually strengthening the transitional government, and gradually moving toward reconciliation combined to give Syrians real reasons to be hopeful. Nor has every situation that might have ended catastrophically actually done so. In one instance, after 3 Syrian soldiers were killed in Lebanese territory and the Syrian Transitional Army responded with artillery attacks against local smugglers, the Lebanese and Syrian armies ended up poised for a ruinous clash. Instead, both sides were able to work out a ceasefire within a day, and while issues around the two nations' shared border continue, Lebanon and Syria have been able to keep their peace and take mutual steps to draw down Hezbollah-led smuggling operations in the area. It's a relatively small victory when compared to the sectarian violence and even the ethnic cleansing elsewhere, but progress is progress, nonetheless. As the weeks tick by, one outstanding challenge for the new Syrian government is the crush of Western sanctions on the country, most of which are yet to be lifted. These sanctions are holdovers from the Assad era, and while international policymakers have been well within their right to fear that Sharia and Syria's new leaders would take advantage of foreign financing to establish their own tyrannical rule, it's now been so long that the sanctions are starting to undermine Syria's chance at future success. Because Syria is iced out from the global financial system, barred from receiving foreign investment, and all but unable to engage in trade, the interim government has precious little wealth to go around. Civil servants are mostly unpaid, and, as we've already mentioned, the new security forces are in the same situation, depriving the government of a key point of leverage to get the security forces to actually listen to Damascus in the future. Without reprieve from sanctions, the transitional government will be very limited in what it can accomplish, and every day of stagnation is another day for the nation to turn sour on a government that seems to have momentum. As The Economist points out, quoting again, relief could be offered in a way that lets sanctions snap back should Mr. Sharia ever be tempted to turn Syria into a despotic jihadist state. For now, though, Syrians seem to believe his protestations that he is planning no such thing. Right now, Syrians are waiting for their government to rebuild a nation, but with no money to do it, the transitional government is forced to leave its people to fight for the scraps, because a future in which there's anything more than scraps to go around just can't arrive until things change. And it's here that we find the risk that the perceived impossibility of Syria's recovery will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The ongoing violence across the country, the pains of reconciliation, the profound horror of the massacres in Latakia and Tartus, and the risk of further devolution are all critical problems to address. But none of them doom Syria. None of them place Syria into a position from which the nation cannot recover through time, smart leadership, international cooperation, and a hell of a lot of luck. The only thing that ensures that Syria cannot recover would be for Syrians and the international community to fail to work toward a Syrian recovery. World governments are doing exactly that right now, combining financial measures with a near complete lack of initiative, and thus making it all the harder for Syria to escape this immediate post-war purgatory. Now, in the wake of unspeakable tragedy perpetrated by Syrians against Syrians, a portion of the nation appears uninterested in working with Damascus, and after what they've suffered, they've got every right to refuse. But the majority of Syrians are ready to work with the transitional government despite its profound flaws and despite the new scars that have been very recently inflicted on this nation. There is still a path toward true reconciliation and true reconstruction for a country that has earned a rebirth through blood, tears, and incredible pain. But that path is narrowing by the day, and if every party in Syria and every world nation that interacts with Syria chooses to stay their current course, then Syria won't get there. Is the Syrian civil war over? Maybe. Maybe not. But it should be, and it can be. If Syria's next decade is as tragic as its last, then it'll be made all the more bitter because things don't have to be that way. And if that's ultimately what happens, then it'll be because this moment, the one in front of us right now, was wasted. Thank you for watching.